In the early 1921, Greenwood was a pleasant environment for the African American population of Oklahoma. Everyone knew it, including Viola Fletcher, a little girl who was only 7 years old and could enjoy a good childhood. She lived in a nice house with her parents and her 5 siblings. During the day, she attended school and played with friends on safe streets, watched by good neighbors. At her young age, she noticed that adults also enjoyed that sense of well-being. Greenwood was undoubtedly a thriving place that sparked aspirations. As Viola would remember decades later when she was already an old woman, she had everything a child could need. But the idyll came to an end on the night of May 31st. Viola had already gone to bed when her parents woke her up and told her they had to leave. They did the same with her siblings, including a newborn. Despite the loud noises outside, they crossed the hall and exited. There, the girl realized that everything she thought about her neighborhood wasn't entirely true. Looking out onto the street, she was stunned to see the asphalt covered with the bodies of her neighbors and friends. There was fire all around her. You could smell the smoke and hear gunshots. What she didn't know was that this was just a fragment of the horror that had been unleashed, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Why has one of the worst racial massacres in the United States been silenced for decades? Why? Were thousands of innocent people hunted down and massacred in Tulsa in 1921 by the Ku Klux Klan? How is it possible that a simple rumor unleashed a massacre that destroyed an entire prosperous community? Is it true that private planes bombed an entire neighborhood? To understand this chain of resentment, devastation, and survival, we need to go back to May 31st, 1921. The day the Tulsa Massacre happened, African Americans were part of Oklahoma even before its founding in 1907. In the late 1800s, they labored in agriculture and built railroads and buildings. Many were descendants of slaves who had lived with members of the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee tribes. Others were descended from slaves who had escaped during the Civil War. Some had come from other United States states like Mississippi or Missouri, seeking a quieter and more prosperous life in those lands, away from discrimination. By 1900, the number of African Americans had risen to 55,000. In the early 20th century, they settled in 27 towns, primarily in Tulsa. Founded between 1828 and 1938, Tulsa went from being an indigenous settlement to the most thriving city in Oklahoma. There were plans to turn it into one of the nation's most representative places, and the residents hoped to benefit from that. That certainly wouldn't be easy. When Oklahoma became a state, the Constitutional Congress implemented the segregation law. From that moment on, there would be places for whites and others for so-called colored people. Despite this, they still formed their own communities and lived as they chose. But another crucial change occurred. When oil was discovered in Tulsa, this finding turned those lands into a nerve center of the oil industry. Tulsa grew so rapidly that it earned the nickname of the Magic City, but African descendants didn't feel the same way. The segregation law became stricter, to the point that they could work there, but they couldn't even use the restroom in a restaurant. Still, no law could deter their resolve to lead a decent life in the area. They settled in Greenwood, a northern district of the city, finding homes to live in despite being unsatisfied. Some of the African Americans who migrated were educated, experienced, and ambitious professionals. Recognizing the area's potential, they quickly built a business to capitalize on the economic opportunities. It worked, so they built another one and then several more until they established a commercial district known as Deep Greenwood. Supermarkets, clothing stores, warehouses, schools, hospitals, hotels, and churches were built. Locals had access to cafes and bars for food, offering various high-quality branded products. When it was time to have fun, they went to the Dreamland Theater, a complex with 750 seats where they could watch plays, musical shows, and movie screenings. The Dixie Theater, with 1,000 seats, was successful despite being owned by white businessmen. Tulsa Star and Oklahoma Sun newspapers were founded to provide vital information. In just a few years, Greenwood had businesses built by and for African Americans. Greenwood Avenue remained the backbone, being the only one in Tulsa that did not intersect with neighborhoods other than those of African descent. In the early days, people in the surrounding areas called Greenwood Little Africa. Thanks to its progress, it earned a more notable nickname, Black Wall Street, in reference to New York's Wall Street. Vision, hard work, and persistence had turned it into one of the most commercially active communities in the United States, a success story that had surprised the world. By 1921, Gringotts was making history and commanding respect, and that provoked the hostility of the most racist white people, especially the members of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was a far-right white supremacist group dedicated to spreading hatred against African Americans. The first incarnation of the Klan emerged in 1865, led by veterans of the Civil War. These men opposed the reconstruction of the country and chose to reject the freed slaves. They pressured to prevent them from progressing, but then they began to persecute and murder them. Their white robes and burning crosses were and still are their trademark, but their criminal roots caused them to be rejected by the Southern elites. They were ultimately dissolved by the Civil Rights Act of 1871 by then-President Ulysses Grant. But the contempt of the whites never disappeared. The Ku Klux Klan acquired a second incarnation in 1915. That new breed took shape inspired by the movie The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the original Klan. But above all, the case of Leo Frank, a factory owner lynched after being convicted of abusing and killing 13-year-old employee Mary Pagan, had an influence. Frank's Jewish religion fueled the controversy, which also had an anti-Semitic tone. Lynchings were common from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. The executioners used the most atrocious methods of torture, often in front of an audience that enjoyed the execution as if it were a spectacle. Going back to the Ku Klux Klan, its second version grew in just a few years. They were unemployed men, angry at life, who blamed their frustrations on African Americans and anyone who was different from them. A high percentage of them had just returned from fighting in World War I, so they had machine guns and other weapons that were more destructive than simple shotguns. One of the states with the most Ku Klux Klan members was Oklahoma. They not only marched through the streets and burned crosses, but also intervened in the functioning of the city. Devotees included respected members of society like teachers, bankers, lawyers, businessmen, judges, police officers, prosecutors, and politicians. They also influenced the local media and had an impact on the results of internal elections. In this way, they gained more and more power. Estimates for 1920 suggest there were 100,000 Klan members in those lands. Those loyal to the group had a declared enemy, the vigorous African American community of Tulsa. They intimidated and whipped them, accusing them of minor offenses. A level of hatred was generated that contaminated white residents, not necessarily close to the Klan. Everyone looked at people of color with suspicion. They hated them because they had found a way to better themselves. While many of them had been laid off from the oil fields after the drop in crude prices, it was only a matter of time before the spark that would unleash chaos was ignited. Before the events in Tulsa, racial crimes were on the rise in the United States. The most remembered event broke out on July 27, 1919 in Chicago. Eugene Williams, a 17-year-old African American, arrived at Lake Michigan with 4 friends, and they started to sail. They were allowed to move within a specific area, but the boat ended up at Beach 29, which white people had designated as private property. There, George Stauber, 24, saw them. Enraged, he picked up a stone and threw it at Williams's forehead. The boy fell unconscious into the river. Despite his friend's rescue attempts, he drowned. Stauber was accused of murder, but Daniel Callahan, a white police officer, was also there. He not only denied that Stauber had committed a crime, but he also protected him. A fight broke out in which one of Williams's friends was arrested. The incident escalated into a riot across Chicago. White mobs mercilessly attacked African Americans. In addition to killing them, they set fire to and destroyed their homes. Rather than being exterminated, some African Americans organized to fight back. Thus, bloody battles erupted. The city hall's refusal to dispatch security forces to restore order was a clear sign of complicity with the whites. The riots ended after 8 days. A Chicago Historical Society report states that 38 people, 23 African Americans and 15 whites, died and over 500 were injured. The riots spread to 18 states, but without reaching those numbers. Neither the newspapers nor the radio stations reported the riots. The government wanted to convey an ideal of democracy in a world that had just come out of the First World War. But the incidents were not ignored by figures like the writer and activist James Weldon Johnson. In fact, he would define the era with the term Red Summer. Although the riots had subsided, the atmosphere remained tense throughout the country. Tulsa was no exception and would become the scene of an unspeakable hell. The horror broke out in Tulsa on Monday, May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old African-American shoeshiner, was not allowed to use the restroom in the salon where he worked. So he had to go to the Drexel building, where he was allowed to enter. But first he had to take an elevator, where he met Sarah Page, a white elevator operator. The two were strangers, and the exact events of that moment remained a mystery. This sparked numerous theories. It is suggested that he stumbled and grabbed her arm to prevent himself from falling. Another says that they were lovers and had an argument. What did come out is that Page started screaming and Rowland ran away. An employee of Rainsbury, a store on Drexel's first floor, witnessed this. The man ran to the elevator and noticed that Page was distressed, so he called the police. Rowland was arrested on May 31st, accused of attempting to assault Page. She was questioned and declined to press charges. It was even determined that there was never an attack, but nothing helped Rowland. After being booked at the police headquarters, he was locked up in the jail located on the upper floor of the courthouse. Within hours, the news spread through Tulsa's judicial circles and local media. Tulsa Tribune, a white and racist-leaning newspaper, published an article with a categorical headline, "A Black Man Arrested for Attacking a Girl in an Elevator." It also published an editorial encouraging the lynching of the accused. The article stirred up all of Tulsa. White people were the first to react. A crowd gathered at the courthouse door, shouting and demanding that they be allowed to take Rowland. Some lit a cross, but the young man wasn't handed over as officers blocked off the top floor to protect him. News of the mob spread throughout the African American community, including Greenwood. Thousands of men went to the courthouse to prevent the lynching. After managing to enter the courthouse, they offered the authorities to pay bail to take Rowland, but they were not allowed to. The spark that ignited everything was lit when the African Americans left the place. The white people were waiting for them outside. One of them asked Rowland's defenders, "What are you doing with World War I pistols?" A veteran told him they were his and they would use them if necessary. The white man tried to snatch the weapon from one of the others. The gun went off accidentally, and that supposedly unintentional shot started a brief but intense shootout, leaving dead and wounded on both sides. Outnumbered, the African Americans began to retreat. The clashes continued for several blocks. The white people took advantage of the raid to attack innocent people who hadn't even gone near the courthouse. The clashes stopped for a few decisive hours. White people from the mob and others who hated African Americans gathered at the police station on 2nd Street. As mentioned, the Ku Klux Klan heavily influenced the police. Around 500 males, including children, were sworn in as special agents by the officers. The orders were clear: get a weapon and get a black person. On the horizon of the mob, Gringo emerged, where thousands of families were about to be destroyed and persecuted. Among them was the family of little and innocent Viola Fletcher, the girl with whom this story began. And that's how our story returns to the beginning. Armed with tools they had looted from various stores, the mob began killing every black man, woman, or child they came across in downtown Tulsa. But killing them wasn't enough. They beheaded them and destroyed their homes. Like an army, the white mob began to rampage, but they set a more specific target: Greenwood, the microcosm that made them so envious. Those who had tried to save Rowland had retreated there. It was a huge district, so the Ku Klux Klan provided even more deadly weapons, starting with machine guns. They also had private planes equipped with explosive charges. They were ready to wipe them out once and for all. Around midnight, white people started destroying Black Wall Street, burning and demolishing thousands of homes. The veterans and other brave men were unable to stop the raid. The attackers outnumbered them and had more resources. Soon, the corpses began to pile up in the streets. The white invaders continued destroying homes as they moved towards deep Greenwood, looting and burning all the businesses in their path. They destroyed supermarkets, stores, beauty salons, upholstery shops, jewelry stores, and offices of professionals. They showed no mercy to schools, hospitals, or churches. They devastated cafes, bars, restaurants, and even the Dreamland and Dixie theaters. The Tulsa Star and Oklahoma Sun offices were also affected. Greenwood Avenue was burning from end to end. The white people enjoyed getting rid of that area. Some even brought cameras to capture their depravity. A few hours later, the police forces showed up, but only to collaborate in the acts of hatred. The African Americans who weren't killed instantly were left defenseless. They couldn't ask for help. The Ku Klux Klan severed the phone and telegraph lines. The survivors had to find ways to save themselves, dodging bullets, bombs, flames, and debris, holding their breath through the smoke. Many families died, but others managed to escape, including Viola's family. The luckiest ones were even able to save some of their belongings, although they had to move quickly. Many were detained by the white people, who locked them up in improvised concentration camps. The slaughter of African Americans in Tulsa seemed endless after 10 post-meridium. Then, news of what was happening in the city would reach Oklahoma officials, more specifically Governor James Robertson. At 11:30, he declared martial law and sent troops to the city. Most of them were white soldiers, but they disarmed the violent ones and managed to restore order. There were still about 6,000 people detained without cause, but they were gradually released. On June 1st, after 18 hours, the Tulsa Massacre ended. The precise African American death toll was never determined. Officials reported 15-20 casualties, but estimates later suggested around 300. The bodies were buried in mass graves or thrown into the nearest rivers. In addition, thousands were injured and more than 10,000 lost their homes. Only sad remnants were left of Black Wall Street. And there was Roland, who, without intending to, had started it all. Adios. Authorities dropped the charges against him and allowed him to leave the city. The Tulsa Massacre was a fact, but the white people made sure it didn't get out, an act as terrible as the massacre itself. For decades, the Tulsa Massacre was unknown to the United States and the world. It was absent from books, schools, and even the knowledge of African American activists. It was as if it had never happened, only the brick foundations of Burnham Church remained. The massacre was only remembered and talked about by some of the citizens of Tulsa. History professor Ben Keppel discovered this. When he arrived at the University of Oklahoma in 1994, he learned about Greenwood, the dreams and the nightmare, thanks to one of his students who had heard about it on the street. From then on, Keppel dedicated himself to researching and sharing information about the events, an initiative shared by Michelle Brown, who later became program coordinator at the Greenwood Cultural Center. Both of them were fundamental in making sure that destruction is now included in school curricula. The Tulsa Massacre was hidden for two reasons. Both African American and white residents wanted to forget and move on, as reliving the past was painful. On the other hand, there were still influential and powerful figures in the white community, enough to intimidate others and limit access to information. That way, they achieved silence and impunity. Thanks to Kepper Brown and more investigators, the Tulsa Massacre gained visibility. The main evidence that it was hell were the photos taken by the attackers themselves, which had even been sent to their friends as postcards. After seeing those images, all that was left was to collect testimonies from the few survivors. It was a tough experience since most of those involved had lost their family members. In the 1990s, attempts were made to initiate legal actions for justice, but the crimes had already expired under the statute of limitations. Among the small group of survivors was Viola Fletcher. Her post-horror life was tough. She couldn't complete elementary school and worked nearly her whole life as a domestic worker for white households. She always lived with just enough to get by. She was accompanied by her brother Hughes Van Ellis, who was a newborn at the time. From then on, Fletcher became an icon. She proved it on May 19, 2021, just days before the 100th anniversary of the massacre, at 107 years old. But with her clarity intact, she appeared before a United States Congressional Committee to speak up for those who were no longer there. She described how her happy childhood was interrupted by madness and white hatred. She recounted still seeing her neighbors' bodies in the street, smelling the smoke and hearing the screams and planes. Fletcher's words moved Congress and the world, which became aware of a massacre that had been intended to be hidden forever. At the time of this video's recording, Viola has just turned 110 years old and she does not forget. Currently, Tulsa has 400,000 inhabitants. Only 15% of the population is black, which shows the deep and lasting effect of the massacre. The need to tell the story and seek justice led to different projects. The Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot was formed to investigate the events, leading to the emergence of the Tulsa Reparations Coalition. But no compensation to the descendants of the victims or a park dedicated to the fallen is enough. The words of Fletcher and other survivors also encouraged the authorities. Excavations were carried out in the mass graves to identify the remains of the victims. In January 2024, the Department of Justice concluded that the massacre was a coordinated military-style attack. It was also determined that there were no survivors left who could be brought to court. As it gains prominence, the Tulsa Massacre is incorporated into popular culture. The series Watchmen takes place in an alternate present-day Oklahoma, where the events of 1921 play a dramatic role. In a time when racial hatred is far from disappearing, the Tulsa Massacre reveals just how far intolerance and violence can go. And not only that, it reminds us of the savagery people are capable of. The human being.